Welcome back, you guys. Today I'm going to show you how to make a semi-naked tiered wedding cake. So this thing is going to be big. Our bottom tier is made with 3 12-inch cake layers, our middle tier is made with 3 9-inch cake layers, and then our top little tier is going to be made with 3 6-inch cake layers. So in addition to all this cake and frosting, I have some tools over here that we're going to be using just to make sure that all of our tiers are properly stacked and supported, which is incredibly important, especially when you're transporting a cake, because you don't want to put all this effort into making a cake and then not get it to the venue in one piece. So this cake is made with my olive oil layer cake recipe, which is delicious. I highly recommend it. And I actually had to make 7.5 batches to make all these cake layers. I really actually made 8, and then I used the leftovers to make some cupcakes. Fun fact, my olive oil cake recipe makes amazing cupcakes. But anyways, we're going to be frosting this cake with a lemon cream cheese frosting, which pairs so well with this cake recipe. So not only is this cake going to look beautiful, it's also going to taste amazing. So without further ado, I'm going to dive in and start to show you how to fill and frost these cakes, and then we'll get to stacking them. So actually, before we start frosting these, we need to level these cake layers. And normally I say leveling is an option for a layer cake, but when you're making a tiered cake, it's super important you level it because otherwise it's going to be so much harder to get a really straight cake. So this is where we become friends with our serrated knife and we trim off the tops of all of these cake layers. So now that we have a little bit more room to work with here, I'm going to start to trim my cake layers. So to level our cakes, we're going to be using a serrated knife, and we're going to be pulling our elbow in really nice and tight against our hip. This is just going to make sure that your arm isn't moving a ton because you really want your knife to stay at the same height as you cut. So I'm going to keep my knife parallel to my counter, and I'm going to just make a mark of where I want to cut, and I'm going to spin my cake layer and just slowly cut. So I'm not applying a lot of pressure here, I'm just letting the knife do all the hard work for me. And as you do this, you just want to be extremely careful about where your hands are in relation to the knife, and you don't want to rush this. Beautiful. So now you can see we have a perfectly level layer. So we're going to set this aside and just repeat the process with our remaining cake layers. If you find that your knife gets dirty throughout this process or any bits of cake are sticking to it, I really recommend rinsing it off just because having a clean knife will help you cut through more easily. Ta-da! If you are worried about lifting the cake and having it break, you can always stick a cake board underneath it to make it easier to transfer. So that is definitely what I'm going to do here because I do not want to break my cake layers. So these cake layers are a little bit shorter than my other cake layers, and I just want to make sure that I'm going to cut them to the same height. So instead of going right along the edge of the caramelization, I'm actually going to be cutting a bit above that. So we've cleaned up our counter, and now it's time to start assembling this cake. So as you do this, it's so important to have proper structure. And the key component of that is the central dowel. So this dowel is going to keep all the tiers together and nice and centered, and as you're transporting it, nothing is going to slide. So this is your key to success. It is a 1/2 inch wooden dowel. You can use whatever dowel you have on hand, maybe a thicker, taller dowel if you're making a bigger cake, or a thinner, smaller dowel if you're making a 2-tiered cake. But you need a central dowel. That is essential. The other important thing about it is making sure that your central dowel is centered. So to do that, you really want to make sure you're right in the middle, because if you're off, as you spin the cake, everything is going to be lopsided. So to insert this right in the center of the board, I actually like to measure it and make marks just to be super precise. So I have a small knife here. This is a 14-inch cake board because my largest tiers are 12-inch. I want a little bit of overhang just to make transport a bit easier. So my 7-inch mark is right here. I'm just going to make a little indentation, kind of aggressive stab actually, but so we're just going to go around, mark the board from a few different places to really make sure we get it nice and centered. So I like to just take my pair of scissors, just stick it through and twist. So I've got a really nice center now, but I've got cardboard sticking out the end so my cake round isn't sitting flat. So to fix that, just trim away any excess. Now that our cake board is ready to go, it's time to actually frost the cake layers. So my frosting has been sitting out now for a couple hours. It's at room temperature, which is great. But when you let your frosting sit for a while, it can get some air bubbles in it. So to help avoid that, I like to give it a really good stir with a rubber spatula here. So I like to really just work the frosting back and forth. We've got some silky smooth frosting here. That is ready to go on our cake. So using my large offset spatula, I'm going to take a generous dollop of my cream cheese frosting and just spread it around the cake board. And this is going to help keep that bottom tier secure against this cake board. So I'm going to use my board just to carefully slide it right where I want it to go. So the key here is not to rush it. The bottom layer is the base of everything. Your entire cake gets built up from here, so it's super important that it's centered at this point. I'm going to add a bit of simple syrup to this just because these layers have been out for a minute. So not something I normally do with my cakes, but for wedding cakes when they're sitting out for a long time like this, it's a really great thing to do just to make sure that your cake is moist. We've covered this cake. Now it's time to add a very generous layer of our cream cheese frosting. So for our final layer here, I've added simple syrup to it already, but we want to flip it over because it's so much easier to frost the bottom of the layer where you have some caramelization as opposed to the part that you cut. So for this final cake layer, I'm going to take one of my leftover cake boards from my other layers, and we're going to do a simple flip. We're going to gently peel this one off, and then we're going to slowly slide this right on. Put some frosting on me. Perfect, you guys. So our bottom tier is finally stacked. So I actually have a couple tips for making a semi-naked cake. One of my tips for making a semi-naked cake is making sure that your frosting is the right consistency. And when I say that, you want your frosting to actually be a little bit thinner than it normally would when you're frosting a cake. Because making it thinner makes it easier to press it into all the nooks and crannies of the caramelization along the sides of your cake. And that's what's going to give it that beautiful look. So as you're doing this, if you are going for a semi-naked look, be sure that your frosting is not too thick. I'm going to use my bench scraper to smooth it out. So I'm setting my bench scraper parallel to my cake board here, and I'm just going to make nice slow pulls along the side of the cake. So when you do this, you're just trying to make sure that you get a smooth finish and remove any excess frosting. You want to make as long of strokes as you can, because if you're taking breaks and pulling off all the time, you're going to have a bunch of lines on your cake, kind of like stop marks where you stopped pulling, and it's not going to give you that look that you're after. So as you do this, add extra frosting where needed, but try to make as long of a pull as you can. So just very lightly spreading the frosting around the cake. So you can see we have such a thin layer of frosting here, but you've got that beautiful caramelization peeking through. And now we just need to smooth out the top. So you can smooth out the top two ways. I'm really unconventional, and for some reason I like to use my bench scraper and pull into the center. Some people like using a large offset spatula or a small offset spatula, but there's no right or wrong way, and it really just comes down to your preference. So I think the most important thing as you're doing this is just to have a light touch, because you're not trying to, push down the frosting, which will create a ledge. You're trying to just gently pull it in towards the center. So a fun tip I like to do is to run my bench scraper under hot water, dry it off, and then smooth using that, because the metal will get warm and it'll really give you a smooth finish on your cake. Our bottom tier is finally ready to go. So now it's time to add in the central dowel into our cake and the supports. And these are so important because if you don't properly support a tier, as you add on your next tiers, they could literally crush that bottom tier with the weight of the cake layers and the frosting. So super important, this next step. So we want to find the center of our cake, and ideally it should go through that bottom hole. So I think that's the center. Yes. So you're going to feel that as you push the dowel through that hole in the bottom. That means that you hit it right in the center. So yay! Doesn't always happen like that, but if you really do measure it out, you should go right through the center. The other thing to keep in mind is to make sure that it's upright, because it could be a little bit off and you want to make sure that it's nice and vertical. Next, we need to add on our supports. So I like to use bubble tea straws just because honestly they're just way easier to cut. I guess if I had a real saw or a wood cutter, I don't even know. I live in Manhattan though, I don't, and so I like to use bubble tea straws because I can just use scissors to cut them, and they're actually very strong. I bought a pack of 100 of these bubble tea straws from Amazon for I think $5 or $10. They're quite cheap and they work well. So what we need to do here is measure how tall our cake is and cut our dowels right to that point. We've marked our straw exactly where we need to cut it. We're going to give it a quick little snip. We want to cut as straight across as we can. Another great tip is as you push it down, if you don't want to stab your thumb into the frosting, you can use one of your extra bubble tea straws and just push it into place. So just really take your time and try to keep everything as straight as possible. So our bottom tier is ready to go. I'm going to pop this in the fridge as we work on our next tiers. Our second cake tier is going to be made with 9-inch cake layers, and we need to build it on a 9-inch cake board. I really like using these boards. I think they're from Wilton, but they have a hole cut in the center already, You can pop it right out, and it makes it so much easier because you know this is perfectly centered and it's going to slide right over that dowel. So I know this seems redundant, but I actually like to add a 10-inch cake board underneath my 9-inch cake board just because it makes it easier when you're frosting to clean up and then to lift it and move it in and out of the fridge. I just think it makes the whole process easier. However, this is going to slide if you put 2 cake boards on one another. I always have some extra non-slip mats hanging out, and we'll just place that right there. To make my middle and top tiers, I'm using the exact same technique as before, covering the cake in a thin layer of frosting and then smoothing it using my bench scraper. I'm inserting support dowels into the middle tier, but obviously not into the top tier because it doesn't have to support anything. So once all of my tiers were stacked and ready to go, it was time to assemble the cake. Like I mentioned earlier, I did all of this yesterday and today is the day of the wedding. So I am wedding ready now, but we still need to assemble this cake. So I'm going to start off by adding my second tier here, and it's really important that we poke that hole through the center of the cake before stacking it. If you don't, as you try to layer it down, as that center dowel comes up through the center of the cake, if your frosting is too thick, it can literally cause it to break and push up with the extra cake, and that's not what you want. So by cutting that in advance, it's going to slide right on, and then we'll be ready to add our third tier. If you want to, you can also add a little bit of extra buttercream on top just to help everything stay in place. I'm actually a big fan of doing that. I just feel like you can never have too much buttercream. This is just going to act kind of like our putty to help keep everything in place. I'm taking my finger under here, you guys, and I'm feeling where that hole is. I'm going to feel where the dowel is. I'm going to line it up, and I'm going to slowly let the cake slide down. This is where I'm pulling out my offset spatula. I'm going to slowly lower this bad boy down. So you can see here I have to pull my hand out, but the spatula helps ensure that it's lowered slowly. So I'm going to add a little bit more frosting, number 1 to help seal off any breakage around the center dowel, and also to just help secure this top layer. So I'll smooth that out, slowly lower that on there. All we need to do now is take a little bit of that leftover buttercream that we had. I put it into a small piping bag, I cut off a tiny little opening, and I'm just going to pipe a thin line around the base of each tier. And this is going to help seal off any gaps between the cardboard cake ground and the cake, and cover up where the cardboard cake ground might be showing. And we just want it to be nice and seamless. I'm going to go ahead and pop this into the fridge now so that it can firm up, and I'm going to show you how we're going to prep our cake box. It might be a bit unconventional, but I love to use moving boxes for wedding cakes. They're really sturdy and they can handle the weight of the cake, and they're also incredibly cheap. This box was only $2. So once I taped together the bottom, I cut open a panel so we can easily move the cake into the box, and then I also removed the top flaps from the box. So now that our box has a beautiful little flap for us to slide the cake in, I'm going to get the cake out and tape it up. Alright, so since this box isn't the exact same size as my cake board, I'm actually going to put down 2 rounds of tape underneath it to help keep it in place and prevent any sliding while it's en route. I hope the Uber goes well. I really do recommend using packaging tape. Scotch tape is definitely not going to cut it. I'm going to lift it up right into the center of the box. Alright, you guys. So our cake is in place. I'm going to go ahead and take this flap, tape it into place, and then I'm going to head to the wedding. So thanks so much for watching. I hope you guys enjoyed this tutorial on how to make a semi-naked wedding cake. Wish me luck for getting this to the venue. If you guys have any questions that I didn't answer today, feel free to ask them in the comment section below. And don't forget the recipe for the cake and frosting used today are up on Chelsweets.com. So thanks so much for watching. Hopefully I'll see you guys again soon.